In this special episode of the Newman Bond, join history professor and director of the Newman University Honors Program, Kelly McFall, as he sits down to talk with author and associate professor of SUNY Albany, Virginia Eubanks.
And today, I'm thrilled to welcome Virginia Eubanks to the show. Virginia is associate professor of political science at SUNY Albany, and she is the author of, among others, Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor, and Digital Dead End: Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age. And she'll be at Newman University to speak on the 1st of February. And so, as we approach that public talk, I'm excited to talk with Virginia about her writing and about her thinking about the intersection of automation, class, and race. And so, Virginia, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I always start by asking you to say something a bit about yourself. Where'd you grow up? How did you become interested in becoming an academic? Why political science?
Yeah, well, I've had a really interesting path into and out of and around the academy. So I think one of the things that's important to understand about me and my work is that I have one foot in the scholarly world. I do teach in the political science department here at the University at Albany, at State University of New York, which I love. But I am only half-time here, and the other half of my time, I am a working investigative long-form journalist. So I have what I hope is a little bit of the best of both worlds, which is that I bring kind of I hope a kind of rigor to how I plan out what I report when I'm a journalist. And I bring a kind of human perspective of really capturing some of the narrative techniques of journalism when I write my academic work. So my most recent book that you mentioned, Automating Inequality, is actually a book of long form journalism and not a scholarly work, but it does, I think, I hope it brings some of that rigor and use some of those tools that I spent 7 years learning when I was doing my PhD. But it is it's a very reported book. It's very much about human stories, sort of the human face of technological change, what that means to families, particularly to poor and working families in the United States. And I came to doing this kind of work because I'm just a really problem-oriented scholar, in that I have a tendency to follow what I think are the most pressing, urgent issues I'm encountering in my community and in my activist work. And for many years, I was a welfare rights organizer as well. And then I bring the sort of tools of journalism or the tools of scholarly research to bear on those problems, those issues, those concerns as well. And that's very much where this book, the book we're talking about today, Automating Inequality, came from. It came from a number of conversations with women in my community that led me to start thinking about technology in a really different way.
Why writing rather than audio or video?
Oh, why writing rather than audio or video as a scholar, or as a journalist?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. No. That's a great question. I think that what I have learned about writing as a process for me is that I tend to take on issues that or problems or questions that I genuinely don't know the answer to. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that happens when I'm writing is that, I tell my students that writing is just slow thinking on paper. And so I really come to understand things I really care about by writing about them. And that's something that has always been true for me to some degree. I was never a big journal keeper, but I've been an on again, off again writer since I was a very little girl. And so I am imagining that podcasters and video journalists do that as well. But I haven't done that. I know what I learned from writing, and really it's the opportunity to slow down and think deeply about something that I don't fully understand. And also writing both as a scholar and as a journalist gives me a kind of weird permission slip to look for interesting people and ask them questions about their lives. And that's something I also find really exciting about the work.
You mentioned your book, Automating Inequality, but let's start there. What's the digital poorhouse?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about the ways that new technologies of eligibility determination, of ranking, and of prediction, how they shape human and social services in the United States. And one of the things that happened when I started to do the research for this book is that I started looking for the moment when I live in New York State, and I started looking for the moment that New York State transitioned from doing mostly sort of analog paperwork around their public service systems to doing mostly digital paperwork around their social service systems. And it's been a slow and incomplete change, as you might imagine. But one of the things that really struck me is that I spent, I'd say about 6 months in the New York State archives, looking at the archival evidence of when these tools started to be used, why they started to be used, and how they were designed. And one of the things that really struck me is that the tools were implemented much, much earlier than I thought they were. So originally, and this is a little bit inside baseball, so I won't go super deep into this, but originally I thought that many of these changes had taken place around 1996, which is when there was a really big policy change in the United States around how our country runs its welfare, particularly its cash welfare system. And one of the tiny paragraphs in this very long legislation included the requirement to automate the eligibility processes for welfare programs in the different states. So I was assuming that that's about when it had happened, that the policy had driven the change. So I went to the archives and I looked in 1996, and I found that New York State had already digitally transformed its welfare system. And it sort of sent me thinking like, okay, well, if it wasn't 1996, then, it was probably in the 80s when the technology became widely available. And I went back through the files and nope, it turns out that the system here in New York State, which was called the welfare management system, was already in place. And I kept going back. And what I learned in that process was that the major digital transformation of welfare management in New York State was actually in the mid to late 1960s. And that's actually profoundly interesting for a bunch of reasons. Shortly, one of them is it gives us a really different idea of what problem the digital tools were supposed to solve. And one of the things that was happening at the time is that New York State was the center of a nationwide, very active and very strong movement of welfare rights organizers. So there were, throughout the 60s and 70s, a huge welfare rights movement in the United States, and a lot of activity around that movement was centered in New York, and particularly in New York City. And so I found it really interesting that these tools began to be used at this moment when there was all of this social pressure on the welfare system to open up and to be more fair and more just than the system had been in the past, which is notoriously sort of racist eligibility rules for public assistance in New York State as elsewhere. And then to answer your question directly, what is the digital poorhouse? What happened then is I kept going back through the files, and I found myself back in the 1600s, realizing that the incredibly intense documentation of poverty, the kind of moralizing algorithms that we use to decide who is eligible and who isn't, are actually tools that have been with us for a really long time, far predating the computer technology. And that those tools are grounded in this actual physical institution of the state or the county poorhouse in the United States. So these are brick and mortar institutions that were mostly built around the 1800s that primarily serve the purpose of incarcerating people who were so poor that they felt the need to ask for public help. Poorhouses did a number of things, right? They controlled things like whether or not you could get married or start a family. Often you had to sign a pauper's oath, which would say that you were no longer allowed to vote if that was a right you had at the time. You couldn't hold office if that was a right you had at the time. Controlled your access to your children if you had children, or access to your other relatives if they were in your life. And it just really struck me how much change and how much continuity there had been in these systems, really for disciplining and managing the poor, more than for providing any kind of sort of uplift or self-determination, which is what the welfare rights movement was asking for, was self-determination. So I use this metaphor of the digital poorhouse in the book to help people understand that though many of the technologies I talk about are new, that what I think of as the deep social programming of those tools actually goes back way far back in our history, and that we actually can't understand how those tools operate and work unless we understand the bigger social history that those tools emerge out of.
It does my historian's heart glad to know that a political scientist has spent months and years digging around in archives.
Yeah, and every city that I went to for my reporting, I started at the public library archives, and I often went back hundreds of years before the tool that I was looking at emerged. And it's actually one of, I think, the big arguments I make in the book is that one of the problems with understanding technologies as machines for making political decisions is that we tend to abstract them from their context, right? We think it's like, the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's just this like blank box that drops out of the sky. But all of these tools emerge from political context. And we shouldn't then be surprised when they're valenced or oriented towards certain kinds of solutions or certain kinds of ways of thinking about the world. In fact, it's our continuing insistence to see them as neutral that pretty much guarantees that we're going to recreate the status quo, just as Kathy O'Neill, who wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, she would say, just faster and with more math. Right? The world we have right now, just faster and with more math. And if you're interested in having a world that's different than the world we live in right now, and I am, then we have to design with equity in mind. We have to design with abundance in mind, rather than designing with neutrality in mind, and then being surprised when we get the same old world, just faster and with more math.
So you talked about the context. So what is the context in which, and clearly the broader context of technological change is foremost in everybody's mind, but what is the political and possibly social and economic and cultural context in which over the past 20 years, 25 years, whatever it is, that this move toward automating systems of monitoring and matching, what does that political context look like?
Yeah, well, let me just really briefly say a word about the three cases that I talk about in the book, because I think it will help what I then say about the context feel less abstract. So in the book, I look at three different systems in three different areas across the United States. So in Indiana, I look at an attempt to modernize the state's eligibility processes for cash assistance, for food assistance or SNAP or food stamps, and for Medicaid. In Los Angeles County, I look at a matching algorithm that is supposed to match the most vulnerable unhoused people with the most appropriate available housing resource for them. And in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is where Pittsburgh is, I look at a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future. And one thing that makes, I think, my book a little different from other books about similar technologies is I start from the point of view in each story. I start from the point of view of families who are most directly impacted. So families who either are applying for public assistance or have lost public assistance, unhoused people in Los Angeles who have gone through the process of what's called coordinated entry there. And in Allegheny County, parents and families who are at risk of being drawn into the Child Protective Services system or who are already managing a relationship with child protection. So in each case, to your question about sort of the political context, the system was sort of rationalized by what sound like perfectly reasonable and even sometimes laudable goals. So increasing efficiency and lowering administrative burdens for public assistance is actually something that is an incredibly important goal. Trying to do a kind of digital triage in Los Angeles County, where the last point in time count show that more than 70,000 individuals are unhoused in Los Angeles County. And of them, like 75% of those people are completely unsheltered, meaning they're just living out, they're just living in the streets. And in Allegheny County, part of Children, Youth, and Family Services stated goal there was to address the equity issues the department had long had, particularly the history of racial disproportionality in child welfare there. But this is why reporting is important. What I found when I talked to families in those places or to unhoused people and poor and working class individuals was that people who were really in desperate need of support were being batch denied resources that they were eligible for, entitled to, and deserved, including medical care. That unhoused people were being classified as not vulnerable enough for help and then criminalized, ending up in jails and prisons rather than ending up in supportive housing. And that poor and working class families in Allegheny County were being really unfairly screened into this very totalizing and many would say carceral systems of surveillance and family regulation in Allegheny County, and particularly families of color or particularly Black and biracial families in Allegheny County, who were very much the folks that the county was trying to protect from what had been too much scrutiny or disproportionate scrutiny in the past. And so really the book struggles with the question of why, like if there were, if the designers of these tools were mostly well-intentioned and the implementers of the tools were mostly well-intentioned, why do these tools keep playing out in the same way? In what are really maybe not entirely predictable, but not surprising ways when we try to automate public assistance.
I'll leave the book there for a moment, and we'll come back to some of these themes. But you've continued to write on these issues, and I want to just ask you about a couple of several articles that you've read on this broad theme. And one of them is about, we'll call them debts, but maybe the slang term for them is zombie debts, and government's attempts to claw back that money. So So what are zombie debts, and why have state and, well, I think you talk mostly about states, state governments tried to start reclaiming this money?
Yeah, so we'd love to use debts in sort of scare quotes there, right? Because one of the really big questions in this work is what is the difference between an overpayment and a debt? And that's a little bit of a sophisticated differentiation, but it actually ends up having some very real effects in people's lives. But the big picture of this story is that after Automating Inequality came out, I was lucky enough to be asked to go talk about the book in lots of places, including outside of the United States. One of the places that I went in 2019 was Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in Australia at the time, there was a huge and really interesting controversy around something that's called robo-debt. So in Australia, which has a more federal system of public assistance than we do, meaning there's one agency that runs public assistance for the whole country, not in the United States, the public assistance is generally federally funded and run by state or local offices or state and local administrations. So in Australia, it's one big office, the Ministry of Social Development. And over several years, the Ministry of Social Development, I might be mixing that up with New Zealand. It might be called something else. So I apologize if I'm getting that wrong. Aussies and my lovely Aotearoan friends, I apologize if I've mixed up the name of your welfare systems. But anyway, the Federal Office of Welfare in Australia sent out what ended up being something like 800,000 letters to people who had gotten public assistance in the past. And they said, oh, hey, oops, we overpaid you X many dollars, $1,000, $5,000 in the past. And now you have to pay us back. So basically just write us a check today or face potential criminal liability for this debt in something like 6 weeks. They gave people a really short amount of time to respond. And after the press there actually reported a lot on the story and named it robo-debt, because it turned out where those letters came from was a new digital system that the Social Assistance Office was using that was guessing which people might have been overpaid in the past. And it turns out very ineffectually. So they were using an algorithm that basically took I think it was like 2 weeks' wages as reported to the Taxation Office of Australia, multiplying it by 26, dividing by 12, and saying that was your monthly income. And then saying, oh, if that was your monthly income, in this series of weeks, you actually weren't eligible for public assistance because you were making too much. Now, the problem, of course, is that is not how poor and working class families' wages work. They tend to be really, really difficult to, just not very stable, right? So they go up and down. You won't work for a long period of time and then you'll work a lot. So if you get the 2 weeks of reporting to the tax agency where you worked a lot, and then you use that to guess what the annual or the monthly income is, then that's just a very bad way to guess people's income. It also did a really interesting thing, which is it flipped the burden of proof. Rather than the state or the federal government having to prove that you were overpaid, you had to prove that you had not been overpaid, which is a really difficult thing to do, right? Particularly if those debts go back several years. So long story short, with robo-debt, over many, many years and a lot of social movement organizing, just in the last couple of years, the government of Australia was like, oops, our bad. This was a huge mistake. You're right. We don't think many of these debts are actually legal, are correct. And the ones that are correct aren't legal. And so, sorry, you had to find all that money to pay us back. Many people, right, went into predatory debt to loan sharks and things to pay these debts back. There are a number of suicides that were directly connected to the robo-debt scheme. And just in the last couple of years, the government has said, oops, like, we promise we'll pay you back. Lost several class action lawsuits. And just in the last couple of months, there's been a huge sort of like countrywide inquiry, a royal commission about the harms of robo-debt. So this was happening when I was in Australia, when I was talking about the book. And so I had a lot of really great conversations with activists and legal aid workers and people on public assistance in Australia. And I came home thinking, I wonder if that's happening here in the United States. And the piece that you're talking about, the zombie debts piece, which I believe was published in October of 2019 in The Guardian, was a piece about what I found here in the United States. And what I found is that it's absolutely happening here. It's happening in different ways that are quite a bit harder to show because of the less centralized way that public assistance works in the United States. But I did reporting in both Indiana and Iowa and found in both unemployment insurance and in food stamps and cash benefits that, for example, I met this 75-year-old man near Chicago who had been paying off a supposed overpayment for food stamps of something like $4,000, I think. He'd been paying it off $5 a month for 17 years, right? So the state was actually losing money collecting from this guy. And he had supposedly run up this debt in a time where he had recently been unhoused or homeless and was in the hospital. And it was, close to 20 years ago. I actually think it was more. I think it was in the 80s. I think it was in the 1980s. And he just didn't have any of the paperwork that he'd need to prove that whether that debt was correct or not. So we just kind of had to take the state at their word that debt actually existed. And so he was skipping 2 meals a month to pay them $5 a month, on which the state was losing money. I found these stories so enraging and so heartbreaking because it really felt like a kind of extortion, right? Of like really targeting some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Most of the folks who I found had these debts were elderly people who were trying to fight a debt from the 80s or the 90s. Or who had stopped trying to fight and were just trying to find ways to pay them back. And so this is something that was already happening before the pandemic. And as you might imagine, is ramping up because the lowering of the barriers to benefits during the pandemic has raised the specter of fraud, this fear of fraud and expense. One of the ways states and the federal government are starting to respond is by trying to claw some of that money that they spent back. And unfortunately, the folks who generally are the target of these efforts to claw money back are some of the most vulnerable and most exploited people in our country. So poor and working class people, the elderly, people with disabilities.
The second article I'd like to ask you to talk briefly about, you write about the rollout of an automated system of, I believe, logging hours is an accurate way to represent it, for home healthcare workers in Arkansas. Why did they decide to move to this kind of automated system, and what have been the effects?
Yeah, so the system's called electronic visit verification. And the reason that states have been moving towards electronic visit verification in home health care is actually a piece of legislation that was signed in the last year of the Obama administration I believe it was like paragraph 10,006 or 10,007 of this huge omnibus bill says that any home personal care assistance or home health care aid that is paid for by Medicaid or Medicare has to, the agency or the individual has to use an electronic visit verification system to ensure that the services were actually provided at the time and in the place where they say it was provided. And so that's the important thing. It's not just hours they're logging hours and location. And it really is the and location part that starts to dig us into some really complicated stuff. So for example, the disability rights community or the disability justice community often has real issues with electronic visit verification because, as you would imagine, home health care workers or personal care assistants tend to be located with the person they're caring for. So what you're actually creating is a map of the daily activities of disabled people or people with disabilities. And there are real concerns about the way that that can roll back some of the important successes of the disability justice movement and the Americans with Disabilities Act or the independent living movement, which is the fundamental idea there being that people with disabilities should be able to be self-determining in how they engage the world, how they go about their life, and how they engage or don't engage with help that is available to them. So I spoke in Arkansas to some really extraordinary people, including Melissa Harville and Kevin Hooper. And Melissa is, Kevin is her partner, and Melissa is, Kevin has been in a wheelchair since the 1990s, I believe. And Melissa does some home health care work for him, some personal care assistance work for him in their home. And so what's really interesting is, of course, particularly family caregivers work 24/7, right? It's not like they're like, oh, Kevin, I'm sorry, like I'm off the clock. Like if you need a shower, that's just too bad. You're going to have to wait till 9 o'clock tomorrow. It's not how home health care, it's not how family caregiving works. And yet Melissa is constantly having to sort of log in and out of her shifts at home. And most importantly, they found that she cannot log in and out for her hours if she is away from their house. So when I first met Melissa and Kevin, she took me around the property and she showed me using the app where the invisible fence was that they could not cross. And of course, her plan of care for Kevin includes things like helping him get to doctor's appointments and doing grocery shopping and those kinds of errands, but she can't log in for her hours outside of the home without it flagging her for possible fraud. And then she had to work that out with her agency every time it happens. So what Melissa and Kevin told me is that it felt like they were wearing a digital ankle shackle, that when they had been living very, very active lives. Kevin's a musician. He used to go out and jam, right? Like they used to go visit friends. And they felt like they couldn't do it anymore because they live in such a rural location that anytime they leave the house, they're afraid they're not going to be able to log back in at the right time. That means that Melissa will get paid for that period that she's caring for Kevin. And so there have been real issues about surveillance and about impairing the mobility of people with disabilities.
Maybe that gives us maybe a way to kind of move outward and think about all of these stories together. Because one of the arguments that people might make is that this is just bad design, that over time, as we learn how to do this better, we'll be able to maximize the efficiencies and eliminate as many of the hiccups as we possibly can. Is that an argument you accept, or are there kind of, as you say, with the kind of limitations of or the visibility this gives to people with disabilities, are there inherent problems with this that efficiencies in good design won't eradicate?
Yeah, so efficiency is such an interesting word here, because I think one of the things that I find really interesting, and this is why why history matters, right? Is like, what is the nature of the system that we are trying to make more efficient? So if we had a system that saw public assistance as part of a system of ensuring people's basic human rights, right? That said, every single human being, just by existing on this planet, has a basic right to a certain amount of dignity and security in life and living. So basic things like, I don't know, there are other countries who do it differently than the United States. And some of the things they choose are things like healthcare. There are people who, there are places in the world where healthcare is considered a human right, not in the United States, but elsewhere it is. Or housing, or a basic minimum standard of living, right? These are things that are considered basic human rights in other places in the world. And their systems are set up in a quite different way. What draws me to this question of whether this is a bug or a feature, right? Is it a design flaw, or is it the system working the way it's supposed to, just faster and with more math? Is that we have a tendency to assume that public assistance in the United States is fundamentally a triage problem and a communication problem, right? The right information needs to get to the right place in order for the limited resources we have to be shared as fairly and as quickly as possible. But that, in fact, if you look at the history, is never how our system has worked. It is not the sort of fundamental structure of the system. The fundamental structure of the system is to first do a kind of moral diagnosis. If you are poor, what is wrong with you? And how can we fix this thing that's wrong with you so you will no longer be poor? And that is a way of looking at poverty. It's a theory about poverty, that poverty is a result of individual failings, that I believe is empirically provably false, and has been extraordinarily damaging to having a robust social assistance state in the United States. It is also, of course, deeply connected to the history of race and racism in the United States as well. So I think if you're designing a system that does not work explicitly against these basic moral ideas that are baked into our institutions, then, like I said at the beginning of our conversation, you should not be surprised when we end up getting to the same result faster when we make the system more efficient. And I'd say the same thing is true of electronic visit verification, which is built on these mistaken social assumptions about who people with disabilities are. And the assumption is that they are homebound, that they are not active players in their own story. And that's exactly what those mistaken ideas are exactly what the disability rights and disability justice movement have been fighting against ever since their existence. This idea that people with disabilities are to be acted upon rather than being actors in their own lives. And the great fear here, and this is not just Melissa Harville and Kevin Hooper, but many of the people I talked to for that story said that it felt like the state was trying to turn their homes into institutions. Right? So we had this success around deinstitutionalization of the disabled in the 1980s. But to folks who are struggling with electronic visit verification, to them, it feels like they're just trying to create tiny digital institutions in everybody's home. And I'd argue that that is part of the digital poorhouse as well.
Yeah, I talk to my students about the Walking Dead view of the world, which is where you have to be suspicious of everybody else rather than trusting other people. And it's been interesting to watch as popular culture has moved over the past 30 years toward that perspective in TV shows and movies, how that's affected our politics. But I do want to ask, because you mentioned race, and I could imagine a counter argument which says that historically these systems have discriminated against people of color. Maybe an automated system can take that racism out of the system and allow people of color to access these systems in a more equitable way.
Yeah, yeah. And that is absolutely, for example, what Allegheny County's Children, Youth, and Family Services would say was their intention. Now, the thing that's interesting about Allegheny County is that the tool that they use is inserted at the point at which the county gets reports on possible neglect and abuse in the community. So those are coming in either from just anonymous calls to the hotline, or they're coming in from mandated reporters. So professionals who work with children and who are required by law to report suspicions of abuse or neglect. So where this tool is situated is in the call center, which is the screening center where frontline workers basically make decisions whether to screen in reports for investigation or not. So, and there is a bit of racial disproportion that enters the process at screening, but it's quite small. I know I quote the actual figures in the book, but I'm not recalling them off the top of my head right now. But the county's own research shows that the great proportion of disproportionality, like where most of disproportionality is coming from, isn't at call screening. It's at the point at which the community reports families, right? So Black and biracial families are reported like something like 7 times more often than, so like 700% more than white families. And so if you are inserting that tool at the point of screening where the disproportion is not coming in, then it isn't going to solve that problem, right? So this is one of the real concerns I have around these technological tools, is that they have a tendency to turn all complex structural problems into problems that technology can solve, which are different. They shrink the problem to fit the solution. Let's put it that way, which is different than actually acknowledging that we have a cultural problem or a social problem in this country of seeing Black, in Allegheny County, Black and biracial families as inherently more dangerous and less safe than white families. And strangers and professionals who see children in the course of their day-to-day lives are much more likely to report on Black and biracial families than they are on white families. And so it's actually not going to affect where the huge sort of river of disproportion is coming into the system. And in fact, may have the opposite impact, because it is now taking discretion away from these frontline screeners who actually know that, who actually know to distrust some of the reports they get on Black and biracial families, because that workforce is actually the most female, the most racially diverse, and the most working class of that whole agency. So they're actually closest to the families who are getting reported on, and closest to many of the professionals who are reporting on them. So they have a kind of clinical expertise that removing that from the process may actually make discrimination worse rather than better.
So we're getting to the end of our time, but I do want to ask you one more question about the broad implications of Allegheny County, because that's a little bit different of a case from all of the others in the sense that it is trying to use algorithms to predict. And all of these are algorithms, but they are for different purposes. So we've heard a lot about deep learning and other ways in which artificial intelligence has emerged and changed. Do you have a sense of how policymakers or advocates or people who receive, I guess, services or the rights they are entitled to, support they're entitled to, How are they imagining new applications of this kind of technology, or have they not even really thought that far ahead?
Well, there's been a ton of work among social movement organizations to start trying to think about what a kind of algorithmic justice might look like. There's a well-known organization called the Algorithmic Justice League, for example, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but also doing some really interesting work in the area. And I have a lot of respect for organizations that are trying to do the work of helping communities respond to algorithmic and technological harm that they face day to day. For example, organizations that are looking at digital surveillance in law enforcement, facial recognition in public housing, right? And helping communities think through how to respond to these systems is really important. I think there's a little bit less work thinking through feeding an imaginary of how these tools could become truly liberatory. And that is something that I'm always really excited to see. And I actually think is something that is growing, but that we don't see publicly in the same way we see these sort of catastrophic failures as often. So I think what you're asking me is to predict what's going to happen in prediction. And here's the thing that's tricky. And the thing that I think is a real concern around predictive systems that rely on big data, which is, it may seem obvious once I say it, but is something we often forget, which is that database predictive systems can only predict what they already have data about, right? They cannot predict the unpredictable. So, for example, around the election of Donald Trump, right? If you recall, in the weeks before that election, data center after analyst was like, there is no way this is ever going to happen. And that's because they were drawing on databases of past voter behavior, and voters just behave differently around that election. And I think the hopeful thing, the downside of that is many people who I've spoken to about how they feel about having these systems predict things about their lives is that they feel like they are trapped in the history of decisions in their community, and it is fundamentally dehumanizing because it doesn't see that they can make different kinds of decisions. I think the optimistic way to think about that is that these systems cannot predict us when we are unpredictable. And so it's kind of a call for, I don't know, orthogonal social movements that jig when we're supposed to jog and that zig when we're supposed to zag. And I do think we're seeing that, right? I think we saw that in Hong Kong with the sort of anti-surveillance work of the pro-democracy activists there. Like, I'm sure it's happening all over the country here in the United States as well, in pockets of activism that I'm just not aware of. But I think that an optimistic read on this is that none of us is locked into the system that we have inherited, and that prediction is probabilistic, and it at best can be true about some percentage of how some people might behave, but it's never correct for individuals. Like, it's never right about us as individuals or even about movements. And so I do believe there's all these degrees of freedom in a world that is cross-cut with these tools. I guess in the long run, I end up sort of agreeing with the point, with the the view of the world that thinks that the moral arc of the universe is long, but in the end it bends towards justice. So I'm hopeful in that sense. I'm optimistic in that sense.
Well, that sounds like an appropriate place to end. So I'll just ask you two quick concluding questions. One of them, you'll be here in a month or so. Can you give us a 30-second preview of what you'll be talking about?
Yeah, so I will be speaking on campus on Wednesday, February 1st at 6. And I'll be talking, the talk I'm giving is called Automating Care, Technology, Caregiving, and the Labors of Love. And so I'll be talking a little bit about automating inequality and also these, probably the electronic visit verification story we spoke about a little bit today. As well as reflecting on my own role as an unpaid family caregiver in my own family over the last 7 years in the wake of some really devastating community violence.
And then second, we've got a month, which despite what my students would say is plenty of time to read a little bit and get prepared for your talk. So besides your work, is there a book or an article or a documentary or something you would recommend that will help people think about these issues and prepare for your visit?
Well, I was thinking a lot when I was sort of preparing for our conversation. I was thinking a lot about these historical questions, which is maybe why I talked a lot, a lot more about history than I normally do.
Never a bad thing.
Never a bad thing to a historian. And I was thinking about two books that really shaped the way I thought about sort of the political possibility around poor people's movements. And so I'd like to suggest basically anything on the history of the welfare rights movement in the United States. I think it's a movement that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. There's particularly some really great work collected by Premilla Nadasen, including her really fantastic book, Rethinking the Welfare Rights Movement. And then also thinking about poor people's organizing that was explicitly multiracial and anti-racist. And there's a fantastic book about the Rainbow Coalition of the 1970s by Amy Sunny and James Tracy called Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power that I can really, really recommend as well.
We've been talking to Virginia Eubanks, author of, among others, Automating Inequality. If you'd like more information about her talk or about any of the other opportunities Newman offers to learn about your world, like, follow, or share Newman on your favorite social media. Virginia, thanks so much for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you on campus.
I hope to see you guys at the talk. Thanks so much for your time.